a forward, maybe I should say that the story or the short piece of memoir I'm going to speak about is part of what I research in my MA thesis. And I was really fascinated with this story, and I'm glad to get this opportunity to talk only about this fascinating piece of work. So let's begin. Vanvild Kava, one of Isaac Bashevis Singer's later works, is a wonderful example for the power of an anecdote. Its main storyline is an anecdote concerning a text about Yiddish literature, and also the story's own history of publication may qualify as an interesting anecdote in itself. The text was initially printed as an installment in the series Figuren und Episoden von Literaten Verein, which ran in the forwards between June 1979 and January 1980, and recounted Singer's memories from the Association of Jewish Writers and Journalists in Warsaw. In March 1980, the piece about Singer's fellow Yiddish writer, Vanvild Kava, was translated to English and published separately in The Atlantic, subtitled as a memoir. The English translation, which was credited to the author himself, was reprinted as fiction in 1982 in the monumental volume of the collected stories, among other well-known stories such as Gimpel the Fool and Yentl the Yeshiva Boy, selected by Singer to display his best work following his receiving of the Nobel Prize. And my aim in this talk is not only to compare Singer's different renditions of the same anecdote in each of the two languages and genres, but also to explore his playful use of fact and fiction in both cases. I will therefore provide bibliographical and biographical information in order to illustrate the transformation of truth into fiction and the meaning of this transformation in Singer's writing. I will eventually explore the shift from one genre to another and its effect on the reading of Vanvild Kava as a text, not only about a fellow Yiddish writer, but also as a meta-poetic statement about Singer himself, especially in the context of the literary canon. So before comparing the two versions, I would like to provide a short summary of the main storyline, which Singer maintains in both. So in the text, both texts, the Jewish-Polish writer known as Vanvild Kava is presented as an eccentric, even among his own bohemian crowd in the Jewish Writers Association in Warsaw. Singer, the memoirist in Yiddish, or the unnamed narrator of the story in English, describes him first and foremost as a rigorous literary critic who had very little appreciation for consensual, highly respected writers, from Shakespeare to Sholem Aleichem. According to Singer, Kava wrote very little despite his immense pretenses. Singer himself was intrigued by Kava's severe and bold nature, and so he suggested to him to write a comprehensive essay about Yiddish literature, or literature in general, for the first volume of a new magazine, edited by Singer himself and Alan Zeitlin, which was, of course, Globus. After some hesitation, Kava agreed to write this article and submitted it after the due date, exceeding the maximum number of pages they agreed upon. The manuscript Kava submitted, as Singer reveals, begins with several pages of a pleasingly sensible general characterization of Yiddish literature. However, one segment about a full-blooded writer and the use of this idiom in Yiddish referring to talent, and stressing that it is unlike in other languages in which it refers to horses, leads Kava, to the narrator's astonishment, to digress to a very long and exhaustive detailing of horses and horses alone, stretching over dozens of pages until the very end. So indeed, Kava had written almost the entire essay about horses and submitted it as an overall evaluation of Yiddish literature. Yeah, that's exactly my reaction when I read it. Singer, or the narrator, was deeply bewildered by this act and questioned Kava about it, but received no intelligible answer, other than Kava's defeated remark that he is a writer who had already been, quote, excommunicated from Yiddish literature, end quote. Kava told Zinger to never invite him again to write for his literary journal, but still spoke to Zinger whenever they met, and even wrote the preface for Zinger's first book, Der Sottening, on behalf of the pen club. The meaning of Kava's bizarre act and its motive remained a mystery. So comparing the Yiddish and the English text, one should mention that the narrated events occur more or less identically, and that there is no difference between the first publication of Vanvild Kava in English as memoir in 1980 and its final canonization among his selected works of short fiction by Zinger himself in 1982. The major differences between the Yiddish and the English versions are, of course, the varying paratexts and contexts of publication, as well as a few minor details and alternating narrative formulations. I would like to conduct a brief fact check of the Yiddish version as a text upon which Zinger has unequivocally signed the autobiographical pact with his Vorwärts readers. There was indeed a Yiddish-Polish writer known as Vanvild Kava. According to the Yiddish writers' lexicons, his name was Moshe Yosef Dickstein. He was born in Kotsk in 1889 and died in the Warsaw Ghetto. He published some prose and poetry and several dozens of essays on literature, art, politics, and culture, criticism and fiction, and also some translations in Der Freien, Der Moment, Warschewer Tageblatt, and other publications under the pseudonyms Shloime Leib Kava and Mem Vanvild, among others, and edited several anthologies and short-lived magazines. So this information refutes Zinger's claim in the beginning of the Yiddish text that, and I quote, Vanvild Kava ist gewesen ein jiddischer Schreiber, was hat in sein ganz Leben nicht angeschrieben mehr wie eine kleine Broschur und öfter etliche Artikeln. Die kleine Broschur ist kiemat im Ganzen bestanden von Namen von Schreiber und Werk von der Weltliteratur. End quote. Interestingly, though, other memoirists, such as Judith Trunk in his monumental work Polen, made similar observations about the limited scope of Kava's publications, especially compared to his self-aggrandizing ambitions. They also mentioned his vast knowledge, which was respected among the other members of the Writers' Associations, as well as contributed to the perception they had of him as an eccentric. And what about the main anecdote in Zinger's text? Did Kava really submit a 50-something pages long essay about horses when requested to write a comprehensive article about literature in general and Yiddish literature in particular? I did not find any evidence of this event in any other resources, though they offer various different anecdotes involving Kava. However, whether true or fictitious, there is much to be said about Zinger's use of the anecdote as an anchor for a text he selected to appear as one of his most important works of short fiction. Vanvild Kava as a work of fiction is unique among Zinger's short stories of imps and demons, particularly because its evocation of the supernatural is almost non-existent. And yet it's imbued with a sense of mystery and wonder. To quote from the final passage, once in a while, I still try to fathom what might have been the meaning of Kava's bizarre act. But I know that if there wasn't, it dwells there where Vanvild Kava is now, in the so-called great beyond, end quote. I would not try to suggest an explanation for Kava's motives, but it might be helpful to keep in mind the real Kava and his work when discussing Zinger's meta-poetic intentions in the text. I would now return to the beginning of the text and examine a somewhat self-referential opening sentence added by Singer to the English version. And I quote, "If a Nobel Prize existed for writing little, Vanvild Kava would have gotten it." End quote. Thereby, Singer positions Kava, although ironically, among his own ranks. This opening sentence describes Kava not as one of many members of the Writers' Association, but rather as an almost mythical figure. Even so, Singer adheres as much as possible to the contract of referentiality on the author's side. First, through his hinting in the English version at his own reception of the Nobel Prize. Second, by relying on all the other details the English reader knows about him. And third, by not introducing himself as anyone other than himself. So all three of these are signposts of autobiographical fiction. And although canonized as fiction, the English Vanvild Kava is a text in which the reader can perceive the narrator both as mythical and as referring to the real Singer. This was possible due to the fact that Singer was then in the process of becoming a mythical figure, a storyteller visiting from a different, inaccessible world. The commingling of fact and fiction might have been Singer's way of cultivating this image. I would like to explore one kind of interplay between fact and fiction while discussing a prevalent motif in Singer's meta-poetic writing, namely the evocation of real and imaginary texts within the literary text. As I mentioned, the beginning of Vanvild Kava evokes a summary of Kava's life work. And I quote, "During his lifetime, he published one thin brochure and a few articles. Half of the brochure consisted of writers' names and titles of books." End quote. Kava's brochure is mentioned once again later in the text. Quote, "In his brochure, he listed all the literary and scientific works that needed to be translated into Yiddish in order for it to be more than a dialect. Some literati felt that Kava should be thrown out of the Yiddish Writers' Club, and others defended him, saying that he was too ridiculous to be taken seriously." End quote. In the Yiddish version, the equivalent part is where Singer mentions the Nobel Prize, for which he himself was known at the time of the memoir's publication. And I quote from the Yiddish version, "In einem Tag ist Kave, was hat sich gehalten für ein Jiddischist, rausgekommen mit der Broschüre, wo hat erklärt, als es ist nicht so eine Sache wie jiddische Literatur. A Literatur muss enthalten die wichtigste Werk von allen Völkern, nicht bloß literarische, nur auch wissenschaftliche. Wenn die Broschüre erschienen, hat man in Literatenverein gehabt, von was zu lachen. In jener Zeit hat man schon gehabt eine hohe Meinung wegen dem Nobelpreis, aber Kave hat gesagt, dass bloß welche 5 oder 6 Schreiber, was haben gekriegt den Nobelpreis, haben verdient dem Nobelschreiben." So, attempting to trace this brochure, the most probable equivalent published by the real Kava I found was a 39-page long essay published in 1929 under the provocative title, "Zieh's schon voran a jiddische Literatur." This essay is in fact a rigorous examination of the development of Yiddish literature, its current state and its possibilities. Only about 2 pages include heavy name dropping, and the rest is a sensible argument in favor of supporting Yiddish literature by encouraging universal education. Whether this essay is the aforementioned brochure or not, it nevertheless seems familiar. It may also be the equivalent of a different, perhaps imaginary text, namely the comprehensive essay that Singer, or the narrator, asked Kava to write for the new magazine. When reading "Zieh's schon voran a jiddische Literatur," as well as Kava's critical publications in the press, one can strongly sense that Kava was obsessed with recognizing talent and originality, which to his mind were extremely rare. Accordingly, he seemed to be very concerned with distinguishing true art from pseudo art and true artists from pseudo artists. It is unclear whether Zinger was unaware of this previous publication, which would make the commissioned essay redundant, since Kava had already written a comprehensive essay about Yiddish literature. It is also impossible, without further evidence, to know whether Zinger had ever commissioned this essay from Kava in the first place. However, it is possible to explain Zinger's use of Kava's image for his own purposes. Kava was an unmistakably pungent critic, extremely difficult to please. However, he had little appreciation, at the very least, for Zinger, and this is part of what bonded them. And I quote from the English version: "After he was willing to grant me 0.003 as my rating, quite lavish praise for a fledgling like myself, we had many conversations about literature." End quote. And in Yiddish, he says, "Ich hab gehad der Grech dazu, als Kave hat übergelehnt meins der Erzählung und hat gesagt zu mir, ich hab übergelehnt eure Skizze und ich hab gefunden in ihr etliche wertvolle Schuhes." Zu hören, als ein Kompliment von Kaven ist gewähnt eine gewaltige Dergleichung. Wenn ich hab das erzählt, die Leute im Literatenverein haben sie geschrien, du bist ein gemachter Mensch, du hast der Greich die höchste Stufe, du bist rein in der Ewigkeit. End quote. So here, although jokingly and at least signaling towards modesty, Zinger refers to himself as someone who had managed to pass even the Canon's most stringent gatekeeper. And not only did Kava affirm Zinger's place in Yiddish and world literature decades before the seal of approval awarded to him by the Swedish Academy, he also taught Zinger an important lesson about writing fiction, which Zinger mentions only in the English version, while inserting a meta-poetic comment. And I quote, "Kava had put a huge amount of work and study into this useless essay," the essay about horses, of course. "No one in the Yiddish circle has the slightest interest in horses. Young as I was, I had already come to the conclusion that there are multitudes of human actions for which there is no motivation. As a matter of fact, in fiction, motivations always spoil the story." End quote. Zinger says here that the exploration of motives is useless for a fiction writer, and implies that it was Kava who inspired him to leave mysteries as they are, a narrative strategy that plays a major role in establishing Zinger as a unique writer. And as to the literary canon, one can interpret Zinger's attitude towards it in a similar fashion to his relationship with and his perception of Kava. They're both daunting and nonsensical, humbling and negligible at the same time. Zinger had written the Yiddish version initially to commemorate and canonize several of his acquaintances from the Warsaw Writers Association. However, this text about Vanvild Kava had been transformed, in the English version in particular, to a story about Zinger's own initiation into the literary canon. By extracting this chapter from his memoir series on the Writers Association and publishing its final version in English among his greatest works of fiction, Zinger has fictionalized the lost, vibrant scene of Yiddish writers of the Old World. At the same time, he walked a tightrope between being simply self-referential and being overtly self-aggrandizing. Thus, he canonized himself within the world of Yiddish literature, while at the same time, he demonstrated his awareness that its intricacies may be as irrelevant to the common reader of world literature as is the detailed categorization of horses. To Zinger's readers of the English version in fiction, there may as well be no such thing as Yiddish literature, as he says in the Yiddish text. And yet, Zinger is its crown jewel. Thank you so much for listening. I would love to hear your comments.